The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the small town of Willow Creek. Nestled in the heart of rural America, this town was a place where time seemed to slow down, where the hustle and bustle of city life felt like a distant memory. For Evan Miller, a young historian with an insatiable curiosity, Willow Creek was the perfect place to begin a new chapter of his life. Evan had always been drawn to the stories of the past, tales of forgotten people and places that once held great significance, but had since faded into obscurity. When he first heard about the old Rivers mansion on the outskirts of Willow Creek, his interest was piqued. The mansion, long abandoned and shrouded in mystery, had a reputation for being haunted. The locals avoided it, whispering about strange occurrences and eerie sounds that emanated from within its decaying walls. But for Evan, these stories were not a deterrent. They were an invitation. He saw the mansion as a puzzle waiting to be solved, a story waiting to be told. So with his research materials packed and his mind brimming with excitement, Evan moved to Willow Creek, eager to uncover the secrets of the Rivers mansion. His girlfriend, Sarah Hartman, accompanied him on this adventure. Sarah was the grounding force in Evan's life, practical, supportive, and always there to offer a dose of reality when his imagination ran wild. She admired Evan's passion, but couldn't help feeling uneasy about his latest project. The mansion gave her the creeps, and the stories she heard from the townsfolk only deepened her apprehension. "Are you sure about this, Evan?" Sarah asked one afternoon as they unpacked boxes in their new home, a cozy cottage just a short drive from the mansion. "I mean, I know you love history, but this place, it just feels different." Evan looked up from the stack of old maps he was organizing and smiled reassuringly at Sarah. "I know it's a bit unsettling, but that's exactly why I'm so interested. There's something here, Sarah, something that's been forgotten for too long. I need to find out what it is." Sarah sighed, knowing that once Evan set his mind on something, there was no changing it. "Just promise me you'll be careful, okay? I don't want you getting too wrapped up in this." "Of course," Evan said, walking over to her and placing a hand on her shoulder. "I'll be careful. Besides, it's probably just a bunch of old stories. We'll figure it out together." The following days were filled with exploration and research. Evan spent hours in the local library, poring over old newspaper clippings and records, trying to piece together the history of the Rivers mansion. He learned that the mansion had once belonged to a wealthy family, the Rivers, who were well known in the area. But after the mysterious disappearance of Emily Rivers, the family's daughter, the mansion was abandoned, and the Rivers family name faded into obscurity. Determined to see the mansion for himself, Evan made his way there one crisp autumn afternoon. The mansion stood on a hill, its silhouette stark against the orange and purple sky. As he approached, the wind rustled through the overgrown grass, and the towering oak trees that lined the path seemed to whisper secrets of their own. The mansion was a grand structure, though time had not been kind to it. The paint had peeled away, the windows were cracked, and ivy crept up the stone walls, threatening to consume the entire building. Yet despite its dilapidated state, there was an undeniable beauty to the mansion, a sense of grandeur that still lingered, like a faded memory of better days. Evan pushed open the heavy wooden door, which groaned in protest. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the scent of old wood. Sunlight filtered through the broken windows, casting long shadows across the floor. He could almost imagine the mansion in its prime, filled with laughter and music, the walls echoing with life. As he wandered through the empty rooms, something caught his eye. A small, dusty photograph lying on a mantelpiece. He picked it up carefully, brushing away the grime. The photo was of a woman, her beauty timeless even in the faded black and white image. She had a serene expression, her eyes filled with a quiet strength. On the back of the photo, in elegant handwriting, was a name, Emily Rivers. Evan felt a chill run down his spine. This was the woman whose disappearance had sparked the mystery that shrouded the mansion. He slipped the photograph into his pocket, feeling an inexplicable connection to her. That night, as Evan lay in bed, the image of Emily Rivers lingered in his mind. The mansion, the stories, the photograph. It all felt like pieces of a puzzle waiting to be assembled. As sleep overtook him, he began to hear whispers, soft and distant, like the wind through the trees. The words were indistinct, but they called to him, urging him to return to the mansion, to uncover the truth that had been buried for so long. Evan awoke with a start, his heart pounding. The whispers still echoed in his mind, leaving him with an unsettling sense that the past was far from forgotten. Something or someone was waiting for him at the Rivers mansion, and he knew he couldn't ignore the call. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Evan made a decision. He would return to the mansion, not just as a historian seeking answers, but as a man drawn into a mystery that transcended time. Evan couldn't shake the image of Emily Rivers from his mind. The photograph he found in the mansion felt like a key to a door that had been locked for decades, and he was determined to open it. Each day, his thoughts drifted more and more to the old mansion and the mysterious woman who had once called it home. The whispers in his dreams had grown louder, more insistent, as if they were guiding him towards something hidden just beneath the surface of history. Back in Willow Creek, Evan spent his days at the town's historical archives, sifting through stacks of yellowed newspapers, brittle letters, and fading photographs. The town librarian, Mrs. Thompson, a kind elderly woman with a keen memory for local history, had become his confidant in this quest. She was intrigued by Evan's passion and helped him track down old records that might hold clues to Emily Rivers' fate. Emily Rivers, Mrs. Thompson mused one afternoon as she handed Evan a thick, dusty ledger. It's been so long since anyone mentioned that name. She was the talk of the town back in the day. Such a beauty, and from such a prominent family. But after she disappeared, it was as if the whole town just wanted to forget. People were scared, I suppose. Evan nodded, his eyes scanning the ledger for any mention of the Rivers family. What do you think happened to her? Mrs. Thompson sighed, her expression thoughtful. No one knows for sure. Some say she ran away. Others think she was taken. But there were always whispers of something darker. Something that people were too afraid to speak of openly. Evan felt a chill at her words, but he was undeterred. If there was a story to be uncovered, he would find it. Days turned into weeks, and Evan's search became increasingly all-consuming. He learned that Emily Rivers had been engaged to a man named James Caldwell, the son of a wealthy businessman from a neighboring town. Their engagement had been the talk of Willow Creek, a match that promised to unite two of the region's most powerful families. But then, on the day of her wedding, Emily vanished without a trace. The search for her had been extensive, but after months of fruitless efforts, the case went cold, and the Rivers family, devastated by the loss, left town, never to return. The more Evan discovered, the more he felt a strange, almost magnetic pull toward Emily. It was as if he knew her, not just as a historical figure, but as someone he was destined to find. Her story began to haunt him, filling his thoughts during the day and his dreams at night. The mansion, once a mere curiosity, now felt like a living entity calling him back to uncover its secrets. Sarah, who had been patient and supportive of Evan's work, began to notice the change in him. He spent more time at the archives or at the mansion, and less time with her. His usual warmth and attentiveness were replaced by a distant, almost obsessive focus on his research. She tried to be understanding, knowing how much this project meant to him, but a growing sense of unease gnawed at her. One evening, as they sat together on the porch of their cottage, Sarah finally voiced her concerns. The sun had set, and the crickets were beginning their nightly chorus, but the tranquility of the scene did little to calm her nerves. "Evan," she began gently, placing a hand on his arm, "I'm worried about you. You've been so wrapped up in this story, in Emily Rivers. I'm not sure it's healthy." Evan looked at her, surprised by the concern in her voice. "I know I've been a bit preoccupied, but I'm close, Sarah. I can feel it. There's something about Emily's story that doesn't add up, something everyone else missed. I need to figure it out." "But at what cost?" Sarah pressed, her brow furrowed. "You're not sleeping well, you barely eat, and you've become so distant. I'm scared you're losing yourself in this obsession." Evan sighed, running a hand through his hair. He knew she was right. He had become obsessed. But the thought of walking away, of leaving Emily's story unfinished, was unbearable. "I just need a little more time," he said softly. "Just a little more, and then I'll stop. I promise." Sarah searched his face, hoping to see the man she loved behind the exhaustion and determination. "Okay," she said finally, though her heart was heavy with doubt. But please, be careful. I don't want to lose you to a ghost." Evan smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "You won't, I promise." The following day, Evan returned to the mansion, this time with a sense of urgency. He felt that he was on the verge of discovering something monumental, something that would finally explain Emily's disappearance. The mansion, with its creaking floors and shadowed corners, seemed almost alive as he moved through it, as if it, too, was waiting for him to unveil its secrets. In the grand parlor, Evan found a small, hidden compartment in the wall behind a portrait of Emily's parents. Inside was a leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed with age. It was Emily's journal, filled with entries that chronicled her life in the mansion, the preparations for her wedding, her hopes and fears, and finally the growing tension between her and James Caldwell. As Evan read through the pages, he felt Emily's presence more strongly than ever before. Her words were filled with a quiet desperation, a sense that something was terribly wrong. In the final entries, Emily hinted at a dark secret, something that threatened to ruin everything if it ever came to light. But before she could reveal what that secret was, the journal abruptly ended. Evan stared at the final page, his heart pounding. The answer was so close, just out of reach. He knew that whatever had happened to Emily on her wedding day, it was tied to this secret, a secret that had been buried with her in the mansion. As he left the mansion that evening, the whispers in his mind grew louder, more insistent. They no longer felt like mere echoes of the past. They were a plea for help, a call to uncover the truth and bring peace to a restless soul. But as the shadows lengthened and the mansion loomed behind him, Evan couldn't shake the feeling that he was no longer just uncovering a forgotten story. He was becoming a part of it. And the deeper he delved into Emily's past, the more he risked losing himself in the darkness that had claimed her. Sarah's words echoed in his mind as he made his way back to the cottage, the journal clutched tightly in his hands. He had promised her that he wouldn't lose himself in this obsession. But as the night descended, bringing with it the ghosts of the past, Evan wondered if it was already too late. The moon hung low in the night sky, casting an eerie, silver light over the Rivers mansion. The once grand estate stood like a forgotten sentinel on the hill, its windows dark and its walls silent, save for the occasional groan of old wood settling in the cool night air. Evan Miller made his way up the winding path, his footsteps crunching on the gravel as he approached the entrance. The leather-bound journal he had discovered weighed heavily in his bag, a constant reminder of the secrets it contained. Tonight, the mansion felt different, more alive, as if it were waiting for him. Evan could feel a subtle energy in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. But instead of fear, he felt a deep sense of anticipation. He was close, so close to uncovering the truth about Emily Rivers and the mystery that had haunted this place for so long. As he stepped inside, the door creaked loudly, the sound echoing through the empty halls. The air was thick with the scent of old wood and dust, a scent that had become all too familiar to Evan. He moved through the rooms with purpose, the beam of his flashlight slicing through the darkness. Each room seemed to hold its breath as he passed, the silence oppressive, as if the mansion itself were watching him. Evan made his way to the grand parlor, where he had found Emily's journal just days before. The room was as he had left it, the portrait of Emily's parents staring down at him with unseeing eyes. He set the journal on a dusty table and opened it to the last page, where Emily's final, unfinished entry lay. He read the words again, trying to make sense of them. Emily had written about a dark secret, something she feared would destroy everything if it came to light. But what was it? Who had betrayed her? The answers felt just out of reach, like shadows flickering at the edge of his vision. Evan closed his eyes, trying to imagine what Emily must have felt in those final days. Alone, frightened, and betrayed by someone she had trusted. The thought filled him with a profound sadness, a longing to help her, to bring her the peace she had been denied in life. Suddenly, a cold breeze swept through the room, extinguishing the flame of a nearby candle. Evan's eyes snapped open and he froze, his heart pounding in his chest. The air grew colder, and the shadows in the room seemed to deepen, coalescing into a single point. For a moment, Evan thought he saw movement out of the corner of his eye, but when he turned, there was nothing there. But then a figure began to take shape in the darkness, a pale, ethereal form that seemed to shimmer like mist. Evan's breath caught in his throat as the figure became clearer, the outline of a woman in a flowing gown, her features delicate and hauntingly beautiful. It was Emily Rivers. Evan's first instinct should have been fear, but instead he felt an overwhelming wave of sorrow and compassion. Emily's ghostly figure hovered before him, her eyes filled with a deep, aching sadness. She seemed to be caught between worlds, a spirit unable to move on, trapped by the events of her past. "Emily," Evan whispered, his voice trembling with emotion. He couldn't believe what he was seeing, yet it felt so real, so vivid. He reached out a hand, but she remained just out of reach, her form wavering like a reflection on water. Emily's lips moved, but no sound came. Instead, images began to flood Evan's mind, disjointed, fragmented visions of the past. He saw the mansion in its glory days, filled with light and life. He saw Emily, young and vibrant, her laughter echoing through the halls. But the visions quickly darkened. He saw Emily arguing with a man, her face etched with fear and betrayal. He saw her running through the mansion, her wedding dress trailing behind her as she fled into the night. The visions came in flashes, too quick and chaotic for Evan to fully grasp. But the emotions behind them were clear: fear, desperation, and a deep, unrelenting sadness. Emily had been betrayed, her trust shattered by someone she had loved. But who and why? "Show me," Evan pleaded, his voice thick with emotion. "Show me what happened to you." Emily's form flickered, and for a moment Evan thought she would vanish. But then the visions returned, more vivid than before. He saw the night before her wedding, the mansion bathed in the soft glow of candlelight. He saw Emily confronting a man in the parlor, the same room where Evan now stood. The man's face was obscured, but his presence radiated a menacing aura. He spoke in hushed, threatening tones, and Emily's face paled with fear. Then the vision shifted. Evan saw Emily fleeing the mansion in a storm, her dress soaked and her hair clinging to her face. She was crying, desperate to escape whatever danger lurked within the walls of her home. But then, just as she reached the edge of the property, the vision abruptly ended. Evan gasped as the images faded, leaving him standing alone in the darkened parlor, the ghostly figure of Emily now barely visible. His heart ached with the weight of her pain, the injustice of what had been done to her. But the visions had been too fragmented, too disjointed to make sense of. Who was the man in the parlor? What had he done to drive Emily to such desperation? "Emily," Evan said softly, his voice breaking, "I want to help you, but I need to understand. What happened to you?" For a moment, Emily's ghostly figure seemed to waver, her eyes locked with Evan's. Then slowly she began to fade, her form dissolving into the darkness like mist in the morning light. The temperature in the room began to rise, and the oppressive silence lifted, leaving Evan standing alone, his heart heavy with unanswered questions. He sank into a nearby chair, his mind racing. The connection he felt to Emily had only grown stronger, and he knew he couldn't stop now, not when he was so close to the truth. But the more time he spent in the mansion, the more he felt himself slipping away from reality. The lines between past and present, between the living and the dead, were beginning to blur. Back at the cottage, Sarah waited for Evan, her worry growing with each passing hour. She could see the toll this obsession was taking on him, how he seemed more distant, more haunted each day. She loved him deeply, but she feared that the mansion, and whatever secrets it held, were slowly consuming him. When Evan finally returned home, exhausted and pale, Sarah knew something had changed. He didn't speak much, only murmuring about visions and whispers, about a darkness that had taken hold of Emily Rivers and threatened to take hold of him too. "Evan, please," Sarah implored, taking his hands in hers. "You're scaring me. This isn't healthy. You need to stop before it's too late." But Evan's eyes were distant, his thoughts already back at the mansion, with the ghostly figure of Emily and the secrets she carried. "I can't, Sarah," he said, his voice strained. "I'm so close. She's showing me what happened, what was done to her. I can't walk away now. I need to know the truth." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes as she looked at the man she loved, knowing she was losing him to something she couldn't fight. "Just be careful," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Please, Evan, don't lose yourself in this." Evan nodded, though the words felt hollow. He was already lost in a past that wasn't his own, in a mystery that had taken hold of his heart and mind. As he lay in bed that night, The whispers returned, louder and more insistent than ever. They pulled him back to the mansion, to the darkness that lurked within its walls. And as he closed his eyes, the ghostly image of Emily Rivers filled his mind, her sorrowful eyes pleading with him to uncover the truth, to free her from the torment that had held her captive for so long. Evan knew he couldn't stop now, not when the past was so close to revealing its secrets. But as he drifted into a restless sleep, he couldn't shake the feeling that the deeper he delved into Emily's story, the more he risked losing himself to the shadows that had claimed her. The days following Evan's encounter with Emily's ghost passed in a blur of fevered research and restless nights. Every moment he wasn't at the mansion, he was at the town's historical society, combing through records with an intensity that bordered on desperation. The visions Emily had shown him, fragmented and haunting, were etched into his mind, driving him to uncover the truth about what had happened to her. The Historical Society's archives became Evan's sanctuary, the dim light of the reading lamps casting long shadows across the rows of old documents and dusty books. Mrs. Thompson, the librarian, watched with growing concern as Evan spent hours hunched over brittle papers, his eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep. "Evan, dear, you need to take a break," she said one afternoon, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been at this for days. Why don't you go home and get some rest?" But Evan barely looked up from the faded letter he was examining. "I'm close, Mrs. Thompson. I can feel it. There's something here. Something everyone missed." Mrs. Thompson sighed, her worry deepening. She had seen this kind of obsession before, the kind that consumed a person entirely, leaving nothing but a hollow shell. But Evan was beyond listening to reason. His mind was fixed on Emily Rivers, and nothing else mattered. As the days wore on, Sarah's anxiety grew. She watched helplessly as Evan became more distant, his focus narrowing to the point where he barely acknowledged her presence. The man she loved was slipping away, consumed by a mystery that had long been buried in the past. One evening, Sarah confronted Evan as he prepared to leave for the Historical Society once more. The cottage was dark, the only light coming from the lamp on the table, where Evan had left his notes scattered in disarray. "Evan, please," Sarah begged, her voice trembling. "This has to stop. You're not sleeping. You're not eating. You're barely living. I'm scared for you." Evan paused, his hand on the doorknob, and turned to face her. His eyes were shadowed with exhaustion, but they burned with a fervor that frightened Sarah. "I can't stop, Sarah," he said, his voice taut with urgency. "I'm so close. Emily's been trying to show me the truth, and I'm finally starting to piece it together." "Evan, you're losing yourself," Sarah cried, tears brimming in her eyes. "This isn't healthy. You're chasing ghosts, literally. I can't just stand by and watch you destroy yourself." Evan stepped forward, his expression softening as he took Sarah's hands in his. "I know this is hard to understand," he said gently, "but I need to do this. Emily's spirit is trapped, and I'm the only one who can help her. I promise once I've figured it out, I'll stop. But until then, I can't walk away." Sarah looked into his eyes, searching for the man she knew, the man who had once filled her life with warmth and love. But all she saw was a stranger, someone consumed by a past that wasn't his own. "I just don't want to lose you," she whispered, her voice breaking. Evan squeezed her hands, guilt gnawing at him. "You won't," he said, though he could hear the uncertainty in his own voice. "I promise." With that, he left, the door closing softly behind him. Sarah stood there for a long moment, feeling a deep, helpless sorrow. She knew she couldn't stop him, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this path would lead to something terrible. At the Historical Society, Evan resumed his research with renewed vigor. He dug through old financial records, letters, and legal documents, searching for any clue that might explain Emily's disappearance. His obsession had reached a fever pitch. Every discovery, no matter how small, fueled his determination. Finally, one late afternoon, as the sun dipped low in the sky, Evan found what he had been searching for. Among a stack of old letters, he came across a series of correspondences between Emily's father, Mr. Rivers, and James Caldwell's father. The letters were formal, discussing the terms of the marriage between Emily and James. But one letter, dated just days before Emily's disappearance, caught Evan's eye. The letter was written by James Caldwell himself, and its tone was cold, calculating. In it, James expressed frustration with Emily's refusal to comply with his demands. He hinted at financial troubles in his desperation to secure the marriage to save his family's fortune. The final line sent a chill down Evan's spine. If Emily cannot be persuaded, then more drastic measures may be required. Evan's hands trembled as he read and reread the letter. The implications were clear. James Caldwell had been desperate, willing to do whatever it took to secure his future. And when Emily had resisted, something terrible had happened. Driven by a mix of dread and determination, Evan returned to the mansion that night, the letter clutched tightly in his hand. The mansion loomed ahead, its windows dark and foreboding, the air around it thick with an unnatural chill. As Evan entered the grand parlor, the familiar cold breeze swept through the room, and the shadows deepened. He knew Emily was there, waiting for him. He pulled out the letter and held it up, his voice shaking with emotion. "I found it, Emily," he called out into the darkness. "I know what happened. James, he was desperate, and he did something to you. He couldn't let you leave, couldn't let you ruin his plans. He was responsible for your disappearance." The room grew colder, and the shadows began to swirl around him. Then, slowly, Emily's ghostly figure appeared before him, her eyes filled with a sorrow that pierced Evan's heart. She reached out a hand, and Evan felt a cold touch against his cheek, as if she were trying to communicate her gratitude. But then the visions returned, more vivid and terrifying than before. Evan saw James confronting Emily in the parlor, his face twisted with anger. He saw Emily trying to flee, but James caught her, his hands rough as he dragged her back into the mansion. The scene shifted, and Evan saw Emily struggling, heard her cries for help as James's fury grew. Then, in a final horrifying moment, Evan saw James strike Emily, saw her fall, her head striking the edge of the mantelpiece with a sickening thud. She lay still, her eyes wide with shock as blood pooled beneath her. James stood over her, his face pale with horror at what he had done. Evan gasped, stumbling back as the vision faded, leaving him breathless and shaken. Emily's spirit hovered before him, her eyes filled with a deep, unrelenting sadness. She had been murdered, her life taken by the man she had trusted, and her spirit had been trapped in the mansion ever since, waiting for someone to uncover the truth. Tears welled in Evan's eyes as he looked at Emily, his heart heavy with the weight of her tragic fate. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered. "I'll make sure the truth is known. I'll help you find peace." Emily's form flickered, her expression softening as she gazed at him with gratitude. Then, slowly, she began to fade, her spirit finally beginning to find the rest it had been denied for so long. As she disappeared, the oppressive weight in the mansion lifted, and the air grew warmer. Evan sank to his knees, the letter slipping from his hand. The truth had been unveiled, but at what cost? His mind was a whirlwind of emotions, relief, sorrow, and a deep exhaustion that threatened to overwhelm him. But even as he sat there, drained and hollow, a new fear took hold. He had uncovered the truth, but in doing so, he had become entangled in the darkness that had claimed Emily. And as much as he wanted to believe he could walk away, he knew the shadows of the past would not release him so easily. When Evan finally returned to the cottage, Sarah was waiting for him, her face pale with worry. She rushed to him as he entered, her arms wrapping around him in a tight embrace. "Evan, what happened?" she asked, her voice filled with fear. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Evan hugged her back, his body trembling with the weight of everything he had uncovered. I found out what happened to Emily," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "She was murdered, Sarah, by the man she was supposed to marry. Her spirit, she was trapped in that mansion, waiting for someone to find the truth." Sarah pulled back, her eyes searching his, filled with a mix of relief and concern. "And now? Is she at peace?" Evan nodded, though the words felt heavy on his tongue. "I think so. But Sarah, something's changed. I don't know if I can walk away from this. It's like the past has a hold on me, and I don't know how to break free." Sarah's heart ached as she looked at him, seeing the toll this had taken on him. She knew they were standing on the edge of something dark and dangerous, and she feared for what might come next. But as she held Evan close, she made a silent vow to help him find his way back, to bring him back to the present, back to the life they had shared before the shadows of the past had claimed him. Whatever it took, she would not lose him to the ghosts of a forgotten story. The first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, casting a pale, golden glow over Willow Creek. The town was still and silent, the world not yet fully awake. But in the distance, the dark silhouette of the Rivers mansion loomed, waiting. Evan Miller stood at the base of the hill, his gaze fixed on the imposing structure. The letter from James Caldwell, now yellowed and worn from repeated handling, rested in his pocket like a weight that he could no longer bear. Beside him, Sarah Hartman held his hand, her grip firm and reassuring. She had insisted on coming with him this time, knowing that whatever final confrontation awaited them in the mansion, they would face it together. "Are you sure you're ready for this?" Sarah asked softly, her eyes filled with concern. Evan nodded, though his heart pounded with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I have to be. Emily deserves peace, and I can't keep living with this hanging over me. It's time to put an end to it." Sarah squeezed his hand. "I'm here with you, Evan. Whatever happens, we'll face it together." They began the slow walk up the hill, the gravel crunching beneath their feet. As they neared the mansion, the air grew cooler, the shadows longer. The building seemed to loom larger as they approached, its presence oppressive, yet somehow beckoning. When they reached the front door, Evan hesitated, his hand resting on the worn wood. The last time he had stood here, he had been alone, driven by obsession and haunted by the past. But now, with Sarah by his side, he felt a strength that had been absent before, a resolve to do what was right, not just for Emily, but for himself. With a deep breath, Evan pushed open the door. The interior of the mansion was as cold and dark as he remembered, the air thick with the scent of age and decay. But this time, he felt a sense of purpose, a determination to see this through to the end. They made their way to the grand parlor, where the final confrontation had taken place so many years ago. The room was eerily quiet, the silence only broken by the distant creak of the old mansion settling. Evan could feel Emily's presence, though she had not yet revealed herself. Sarah looked around, her brow furrowed in concern. "Do you think she's here?" Evan nodded slowly. "She's here. She's been waiting." He pulled the letter from his pocket and unfolded it, the paper crackling in the stillness. "Emily," he called out, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "I know what happened to you. I know the truth." The room grew colder, and the shadows seemed to shift, as if something was moving just out of sight. Then, slowly, Emily's ghostly figure appeared, emerging from the darkness like a wisp of smoke. She was as ethereal and beautiful as ever, but there was a weariness in her eyes, a deep sorrow that had lingered for too long. Evan stepped forward, holding the letter out toward her. "I found this," he said gently. "James, he was the one who hurt you. He was desperate, and when you refused him, he took your life. But it wasn't your fault, Emily. You didn't deserve what happened to you." Emily's ghostly form flickered, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and relief. She reached out, her hand passing through the letter, as if trying to touch the truth that had eluded her for so long. "I'm so sorry it took this long for someone to find out," Evan continued, his voice thick with emotion. "But you can rest now. You don't have to stay here anymore. I will tell your story to everyone so that everyone knows the truth." Sarah stepped forward, her voice soft and comforting. "You can let go, Emily. Evan has uncovered the truth. You're free now." For a long moment, Emily's spirit hovered in the room, her form wavering between the worlds of the living and the dead. Then slowly she began to smile, a sad yet grateful smile. The weight of decades of pain and confusion seemed to lift from her, and she began to fade, her edges dissolving into the soft light of dawn. As the first rays of sunlight filtered through the broken windows, Emily's spirit gave one final lingering look at Evan and Sarah, her expression one of deep gratitude. Then, with a sigh as light as the breeze, she vanished, leaving the room bathed in the gentle warmth of the morning light. The oppressive cold that had filled the mansion dissipated, and for the first time the air felt clear and peaceful. The mansion, once a place of shadows and secrets, now seemed simply old and tired, its mysteries finally laid to rest. Evan stood in the middle of the parlor, his heart heavy with the weight of what he had just witnessed, yet lighter than it had been in weeks. Emily was gone, her spirit finally at peace, and with her departure, the grip of the past on his own soul had begun to loosen. Sarah stepped beside him, her hand slipping into his. "You did it, Evan. She's free now." Evan nodded, a tear slipping down his cheek. "We did it," he corrected, his voice thick with emotion. "I couldn't have done this without you, Sarah." She smiled, leaning into him, her presence warm and grounding. "What now?" she asked quietly. Evan took a deep breath, the air in the mansion feeling fresh and new. "Now we let go. It's time to move on, to focus on the present and the future. Emily's story is finally over, and it's time for us to start our own." They stood together in the dawn light, the mansion silent around them, its long-held secrets finally brought to light. Evan knew that the past would always be a part of him, but it no longer held the power to consume him. With Emily's story finally at peace, he could begin to reclaim his life, to build a future with Sarah, a future unburdened by the ghosts of the past. As they left the mansion, hand in hand, the sun rose higher in the sky, casting a warm glow over Willow Creek. The old Rivers mansion stood behind them, its windows reflecting the morning light, now just an empty house on a hill, its mysteries finally laid to rest. And as they walked down the hill, leaving the mansion and its haunted past behind, Evan felt a sense of closure and relief. The ghosts of Willow Creek had been heard, their stories finally told. Now it was time to let go, to step into the light of a new day, and to embrace the life that lay ahead.